Right, so we are recording now, everybody. Thanks for those of you showing up on time. This recording, as always, will be shared on the Apache DevLake YouTube. We'll always share it first, always to the VIPs in the Apache DevLake Slack, so make sure you're keeping an eye open for that. Today we have a really kind of fantastic occasion, one that I'm really excited about. Clearly the community are really excited about it. We have one of my favorite new friends, and truly kind of a fantastic citizen of the open source universe, my friend Nathen Harvey, who I'll let introduce himself. But we're really fortunate to have Nathen here today. We're going to be diving into the lake, diving into DORA, taking a closer look at what this is, why you should care about it. But I think most importantly, we're going to spend a bit more time kind of discussing different ways that you can think about really turning DORA into something more actionable, more practical. What does it actually look like to use DORA to drive change, drive success, really kind of level up your engineering? So without further ado, I am going to stop this screen share here so that you can see us properly. And I'll pass the mic to Nathen to introduce himself. Nathen, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so grateful for your time.
Hey, Maxim, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be here. And I guess by way of introduction, hi, everyone. My name is Nathen Harvey. I'm a developer advocate, really focused on DORA, and I work for Google Cloud. I guess my history with DORA is interesting. I've been involved with the research program since the very beginning. Although at the very beginning, I was not an advocate. I was not even a researcher. In fact, I was a practitioner. So when the very first State of DevOps survey went out, I was a participant in that survey. But over the years, and it's been almost a decade now that this research has been running and that the reports have been coming out. So over the years, I've done a number of different things. I moved from a practitioner into a role at Chef Software. And then about 4.5 years ago, I joined Google Cloud, who then shortly thereafter acquired DORA. And so while at Google Cloud, I've really been working with teams around the world to help them understand and put into practice the insights and the findings from the research, from the DORA research program. I'm based in Annapolis, Maryland. So if you ever happen to be in this town, be sure to look me up and we'll go get a drink.
Fantastic. Well, really glad to have you here and excited to really kind of talk about this. So I imagine many of the people here that have tuned in and will be tuning in are probably familiar with DORA. That's probably why they're interested. But I'd love to kind of kickstart our conversation by, asking you, if you were to try and capture DORA in a nutshell and, explain what it is and what its value is, perhaps to an engineer that hasn't heard of it before, how would you kind of explain what that really is?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, DORA is fundamentally based on this idea that, maybe a couple of ideas. First and foremost, technology is a thing that enables great digital experiences and pushes our businesses forward. I think as technologists, it's easy for us to get caught up in the latest and greatest tools that are out there, whether it's ChatGPT or the latest in microservices, or, oh, look, a new JavaScript framework just came out. Let's go play with that. These are all super cool, and I do love the technology. But at the end of the day, the technology is there for a purpose. And so DORA is founded on this idea that technology matters and technology can help further the goals of your business, whether that's serving your customers or maybe you're a government agency, your constituents, whatever that looks like. But technology enables that. So that's one of the foundational pieces. I think the other one is that we need to figure out how do we know if we're doing good? How do we know if our engineering practices are working? So the DORA team really had to come up with some metrics for actually assessing that. And we found some common metrics for looking at that. But knowing how well we're doing or how poorly we're doing is super interesting and it is important. But the bigger question is, how do we improve? So how do we get better? And at the end of the day, I think if you pick up any of the State of DevOps reports, or if you pick up the book Accelerate that covers a lot of the research, my hope is that you walk away with an understanding that the foundation here is really about continuous improvement. As engineering teams, as practitioners, as leaders, we need to adopt and embrace a mindset of continuous improvement in order for us to best utilize technology. And it's also clear that using technology alone is not enough. It's the people that use technology. We're part of the system. So we want to use this technology in a sustainable way. And that's really where that continuous improvement and continuous learning come in.
Yeah, that's really well said. And it's certainly been in my experience too, the spirit of DORA is really kind of driving that improvement. And I think most importantly, which you touch upon, is really kind of establishing some benchmarks that capture, how are we actually doing today, and are we as effective as we think we are, or if we're not, how do we get there? And of course, if we're excelling, gives you an opportunity to kind of pat yourselves on the back too, which is, I think, an underappreciated element of many of these frameworks. So like, any tool, you can, of course, kind of misuse these things. And I imagine you've seen, plenty of misconceptions in your time, perhaps many mistakes too from teams kind of thinking about it the wrong way or implementing it the wrong way. I'm curious, Nathen, what do you tend to see as far as kind of those common misconceptions, misunderstandings, and misapplications?
Yeah, there were certainly some cautionary tales, I would say here, Maxim, that you want to watch out for. Try not to head down these paths. One of them is trying to use the metrics. So as you know, and as the DevLake community knows, there are 4 key metrics for software delivery performance that DORA has identified and sort of tested and validated over the years. And one of the pitfalls or cautionary tales I have is I've seen teams try to use these metrics at the wrong level. Let me explain that. They try to ask a question like, looking at these 4 key metrics for throughput and stability, how is Google doing? How many deploys a day does Google do? How many deploys a day does Netflix do? It's not the right question to ask. These metrics are really meant to live at an application or service level. Because the truth is, in every organization where you have more than one application, you also have varying levels of performance. So make sure that you're using the metrics at a team or an application or service level. That's what matters most. Another kind of common challenge I've seen is, great, we're going to measure our teams. So we'll use these metrics to figure out which are our good teams and which are our bad teams. And let's make sure that we, maybe get rid of those bad teams or set up a competition amongst our colleagues. This is also not a good use of the DORA metrics. Again, context matters so much. If you try to compare, say, the deployment frequency of a mobile application, which maybe has some constraints put on the platform that the mobile application is depending or is deploying their applications to. If you compare that to, say, some microservice that you have over here that runs on the web, there are different constraints. And so we can't really compare those teams. It's not comparing apples to apples. So it is really about understanding as a team who's improving more. Maybe that's a better question. How are those improvements happening? And then I guess another pitfall that I see, and this, it's a little bit of a challenge with how the research is presented as well. Because each year in the research, we take those 4 key metrics and we find clusters of teams that are performing at various levels. And we put labels on those clusters. We put labels because we're humans and we need labels so that we can understand them. But unfortunately, the labels that we use, because they make sense to us as people, are things like low and medium and high. And so I have seen leaders go out into their, technology leaders go out into their organization and say, by the end of the year, 90% of our teams must be high performers. This, again, misses the idea that this is about continuous improvement. I'd like to see a 90% improvement from all of our teams over the next year, for sure. But setting this false goal of you must be a high performer, I think ignores some of the context, the realities of where a team is, and what does that customer need from that application. So with any measure, we have to be very careful about how it's used and what behaviors are we incentivizing with those measures.
I think that's really interesting and captures, something that we've seen ourselves, with many DevLake users getting started with DORA. that challenge of avoiding that kind of inclination to immediately use it as an apples to oranges comparison, device where exactly as you say, different teams have different dynamics that can drastically influence where they're performing in the framework. And, that kind of instinct to compare can send you in the wrong direction. And I love the point that you make, which is such a practical bit of advice for our listeners, which is, it's perhaps, as cheesy as it sounds, it's perhaps less about the destination and it is more about the journey with DORA. And it's really about figuring out, like, directionally, are you heading in the right direction? Are you driving improvement? Are you finding ways to become more consistent and head in the right direction? And perhaps that's far more important than, figuring out how do you compare to team X, Y, or Z.
That's right. I think another pitfall that sometimes I see happen is that we take these 4 metrics. There are 2 for throughput and there are 2 for stability. Sometimes we take those metrics and as a development team maybe say, okay, well, we'll take on the throughput metrics. We'll ship faster. But who owns the stability then? If that stability ends up in operations, now we're fighting against each other. Who's responsible for what? And excuse me for 1 second. Hey, Google, that wasn't for you. Sorry, my Google device picked up whatever I was saying and was looking it up for me.
That's so funny. I'm always terrified to say the wrong phrases out loud. The other week, I'm not going to say the name of the device, but it suddenly started playing a sea shanty because a video I was watching mentioned it and derailed my whole day. But that's a story for another time. So I think this is a great bit of advice here, kind of avoiding some of those misconceptions, to surely understand DORA as a way to understand kind of the current state of the team, to translate it into a culture of continuous improvement and, incentivizing perhaps a more structured approach to improving some best practices, but to really kind of see it, as kind of like a state of being, right, rather than a goal. And I think that's such a great insight and a new way for me to think of it too, which is also exciting. And I'm curious, Nathen, there's of course no shortage really of content out there that's capturing, like the what is DORA, right? Like there's never any shortages of blogs that are going in and kind of anguishing over, like what does throughput really mean and what is this metric? But I think one of the things that I've found, and I think certainly our community can relate to, is there's a real shortage of content that looks at like what do the actions look like? How do you actually use this stuff? Like what are the steps you should take? So I'm curious, if you were sitting down with an engineering leader who's maybe got started with DORA, they've gone and set up something like DevLake, right? They've used DevLake to get their DORA metrics. They've got the dashboards. They're ready to rock and roll. But now they're sitting there going, okay, like now what? Like what do I do? What kind of advice do you have for that situation where you're looking to take DORA and bring it into action?
Yeah, I mean, I see this all the time. It is really nice. First, it's nice to have a tool like DevLake where you can actually start capturing some of that data and visualizing it. Because I oftentimes see teams, they don't even know where to get started for collecting this data. If you're in that situation, my advice to you always is if you don't know where to get started, it's actually pretty easy. You can start with a conversation. You can start with a Post-it. Just write down, how are you doing with deployment frequency? How are you doing with change lead time? So you can start there. But then, of course, many people want for more. And that's where a tool like DevLake can really come in and help. And really, we can start gathering this data from our systems as opposed to asking our people. But I will say that asking our people, you're probably going to get a pretty accurate read. You're going to get an accurate measure. So I would continue those conversations with or without the dashboards. So let's imagine that you do have DevLake set up. You're seeing how you're doing across the 4 keys. The very next thing you should do is gather together the people that are responsible for delivering and operating that system and ask them, how do we improve this? How do we increase our deployment frequency while not increasing our change failure rate? What are the things that we could do to reduce our time to restore service when we do have an outage? The thing is that your team probably knows. They have lots of great ideas, and probably ideas that they just haven't found the capacity in their schedules, in their minds to actually go and address. And so just asking that open-ended question maybe is a little bit much. Maybe it's a little bit too wide. But this is, again, where DORA, I think, really comes in and shines. Because while we do measure these 4 keys, the more important thing, in my opinion, about DORA is the predictive model that gets created. Because DORA investigates a number of different capabilities and is able, through our data, to show that these capabilities predict better software delivery and operations performance. Capabilities cut across all different characteristics as well. We have technical capabilities, like, is your team doing trunk-based development? Do you have continuous integration set up? Are you doing continuous testing so that you get good feedback? But we also look at process capabilities, like, how much work do you have in process at any given time? Is your team able to actually prioritize flow through the system over how many things are we working on right now? Another great process capability that we look into is the change approval process. So many organizations have a very heavyweight change approval process that was put in place for good reason. We want to reduce risk, but we can show through our data, and probably we all know through our own lived experience, that those change approval boards don't always actually reduce risk. They may slow down how frequently we're shipping, with maybe no impact on risk, but more often than not, they actually increase the risk. So change failures tend to go up. And then finally, and probably the most important type of capability we look at, is culture. How do your teams, how do the people in your teams work together? How are they sharing information? When something goes wrong, how do they respond? Is there a culture of learning and experimentation within the organization? So each one of these capabilities is really, really important. And like I said, through the data, what we can show is sort of that predictive model. And actually, I want to pull up a quick screen here, if I may.
I would love that.
Yeah, because this is we call this this is called the SEM, or the structural equation model. We also sometimes call it, Maxim, the BFD. It's the big friendly diagram. That's what it stands for. It's friendly, yeah. So, but essentially what this shows here these are your outcomes on the right-hand side, these blue boxes. So if I come down here, we'll see one of the boxes, the blue boxes here, is delivery performance. So software delivery performance. This is how we measure those 4 keys. But what leads to better software delivery performance? So we can actually kind of follow the arrows backwards and say that, oh, these technical capabilities make software delivery performance better. These things like documentation quality and use of the cloud make technical capabilities better, which then make delivery performance better. Delivery performance itself leads to better operational performance. So as a team, one of the things that we can do is sit down and start having a conversation or an assessment of each one of these types of capabilities. How are we doing with, trunk-based development? Let's have a conversation about that. We can see here that it can lead to better performance. Now, this is the 2022 structural equation model. From this site, you can also look at the 2021 structural equation model. And the idea here is that we investigate different capabilities, or slightly different capabilities, each year as part of our survey. So there are a number of ways that you can use this to really help identify where should our team make investments on improving. Because really, we're using DORA, this framework, almost as a way to find the constraint in our system and make investments there.
This is really awesome. And for those tuning in live and for those listening to the recording, we'll make sure that we get a link to that to share with you, and we'll put it in the bio. We'll put it on Slack.
Yes,
really fantastic.
Absolutely.
And it brings up a really interesting question, Nathen, one that I think a lot of leaders struggle with, where perhaps they're looking at one of these kind of flows, or one of these frameworks, and they're thinking about, okay, understood, I'm going to start driving some improvements here. Do you generally recommend that teams kind of look to solve for multiple kind of factors on that flow at the same time? Or do you think it's generally best to kind of figure one out at a time and see how that's moving the needle? I'm curious, kind of, what are your general kind of thoughts and philosophies on this? And I imagine to be fair to you, I imagine it's one of those where there really isn't a right answer to this question, but would love your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. I would say that there isn't a right question or a right answer in terms of which capability should I focus on. But I am a strong believer that you should pick one, and you should start with one. And really, when we take the lessons from DORA and like put that sort of philosophy into practice, if you will, it really is a philosophy of experimentation. Let's take a scientific approach to the engineering that we're engineers, so we're always taking a scientific approach, right? So let's change something. It's just kind of like writing code, Maxim, actually. We change something, we run it, and we see what happened. Did it do the thing that we expected? Well, how is our system that includes us, the humans, any different than that? Let's find one thing that we can say, oh, if we had fewer branches in our code repository, as an example, so we're moving more towards trunk-based development, we expect that will improve our delivery lead time. So how long does it take for a change to get into production? And it will reduce our change failure rate. So how do we know that? Well, let's do some work where we reduce the number of branches and then test out our theory. And then we'll see how is that helping our team. And if it helps, then maybe we do more investment there. Maybe we find that it's hurting us. Well, then we have another question to ask. Is it hurting us because of some mistake that we're making along the way? Or is it a place where we shouldn't be investing? And so my advice always is find that one capability. And also, let's be honest, we're all under so much pressure to keep moving forward. How much time do we have for improvement? It can be a very little bit. But let's make sure that we're making the most of that little bit of improvement capacity that we have. So pick one thing, spend some time doing it. You're not going to snap your fingers and all of a sudden you're doing, you're minimizing your work in process. This takes practice. And so we have to let it run for a minute and then go back and test. Is it actually having the expected outcome?
Yeah, I really like the way you emphasize that. And it's even kind of inviting me to change my own terminology when I speak with, users and introduce people to DORA, where, I've always presented DORA as a tool, which of course it is, but I think you more rightly say like DORA is a practice ultimately. Like it's an approach to figuring out how you eliminate those constraints. And I love that bit of practical advice. And it's something we've actually seen some DevLake users even figuring out for themselves, which is so exciting to see, where they're using DORA to start really kind of identifying like where are those kind of bottlenecks, where are the constraints, and start kind of knocking them down one by one to figure out like, okay, let's figure out what's holding us back on this certain area and what's the thing that we believe is really kind of the cause of that. Let's laser in on that, and then let's see how it pans out over the next couple of cycles and see if it's actually unblocking us in the way that we think it is. And
I think the thing that you're touching on there is so important. I showed you the structural equation model. That's not a roadmap. You have to figure out as a team, where do you step into that structural equation model? Where do you make those investments? Because the truth is, if you look around your team, so gather together everyone in your organization that is responsible for building, deploying, operating, prioritizing which work you do, all of this on this application or service. Once you have all of those people in the room, be very careful, because these are the world-renowned experts on that application or service. No one in the world knows it better. They have all of the context for how do the politics within this organization work? How do the systems work? They know where all of the bodies are buried, if you will. All the skeletons in the closet. They're the ones that know about them. And therefore, they are the ones that are best equipped to understand how do we improve? Where do we get better? DORA provides a framework and maybe some questions, some areas for them to explore that might help. But it is going to be from one application to the next, it's going to be a different answer. From one team to the next, it's going to be a different answer. And I think that's the important piece, is that we're really having these conversations and going into this with an experimental approach and this practice of continuous improvement, this practice of changing how we work.
I love that. No, and I think that's such a key insight to always be aware of when you're deploying, certainly DORA, and I would say probably more broadly, like any metrics framework, right? Where you can fall into this trap of seeing it as this kind of like all-seeing oracle that answers all the questions, but really what it is it's something that empowers you to ask the right questions of the right people at the right times. And that kind of human in the loop, to use some terminology, right? Like that human in the loop system is ultimately where you're going to find the success, versus seeing those metrics in isolation and making those assumptions without including those conversations.
Absolutely. And I also just want to share another thing, because sometimes that advice like there's a lot to it. Now I have to be an expert in all of the DORA capabilities to really understand where should I invest. I want to share this tool with you. This is what we call the DORA DevOps Quick Check. And it starts with a brief survey of your team. And you can pull the data from DevLake to answer this. Again, you could gather team members and have a conversation through these questions, but it's going to ask those 4 metrics that you're all familiar with, right? Lead time, and I'm just going to throw in some random answers here, we'll see. Lead time, your deployment frequency, your time to restore service, let's say I'm less than a day, and then your change fail percentage, and then of course also your industry. So we're going to look at actually 5 different things, not 4. But from here you can view the results and kind of see, where does this team sit in terms of the overall research body, right, with other participants. But here's the more important thing. What we've done on this improvement areas tab is already focus in, instead of 30 different capabilities, here are 3. Teams that have a performance level like yours typically will benefit the most from improving one of these 3 capabilities. So that's great. Now you have 3 things to focus on is too many. Didn't I say 1? Well, good news. We can help you prioritize those. And now this, I think, is the most beneficial piece of this quick check. We can start asking you, how is your team doing on continuous integration? But that's a ridiculous question, because if I ask you, how are you doing on continuous integration, the way you interpret those words is different than what I meant. So instead, we dig into the characteristics of each one of those capabilities. For example, code commits result in an automated build of the software. As a team, let's argue about what is our consensus answer of that. And I don't know what it is. What I recommend that you do is carefully consider each one of these statements together as a team. And you can see that what I'm doing right now is carefully considering each one of these statements. I just want to get to a result here really quickly. So I'm just going to obviously randomly select some answers. No idea what I'm saying or agreeing to. Hopefully it's not too much. But now in this tool, we actually get a prioritized list of capabilities. And so we can see, based on these random answers that I gave, continuous integration, there's actually a big gap for how my team is performing and how we've seen others across industries doing with this particular capability. With continuous delivery and architecture, actually, continuous delivery, we're kind of spot on. Architecture, we're maybe doing better than some of our peers. So don't focus on architecture. Let's focus on continuous integration. And then we go a little bit further and provide you some really good insights here on how to implement each one of those capabilities. So for all of the capabilities that we have a nice sort of guide that talks about what that capability is, how do you go about implementing it, what objections are you likely to run into from leaders or from fellow teammates? What are some of those common pitfalls? And then I think, really importantly, how do we measure this? So let's go beyond those 4 keys of measurement and talk about measures for individual capabilities. Now, depending on how your team works, you might actually take some of these measures and adopt them as quarterly OKRs. Let's put in an objective or a goal for this quarter that we want to increase the number of code commits that create a build, or like that ratio of them. And then we can go and experiment and see how does that impact our overall. So that's a quick bit of advice there. I think using that quick check can really help you start to zero in or hone in on some of the capabilities that might work for you.
I love that. No, these are such fantastic resources, and we'll make sure to share those out on the link in the bio on YouTube, which you'll see below if you're watching it after. And we'll of course be posting it in Slack as well.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think that's always the challenge, right? Is figuring out, okay, we have so many opportunities to improve. We have so many things we could do. We have so many actions we could take, but what are those actions and how do we prioritize them and how do we not feel overwhelmed? Because I think this is such a great way to avoid that kind of sense of overwhelmedness where, it's an easy trap to fall into where you spin up a bunch of dashboards, you have more insight than ever, right? Exciting. Now we know. But, you see so many people that suddenly feel paralyzed with figuring out like, okay, now what? And
now what? Right. Exactly. And those dashboards can provide a lot of insight, but if you aren't acting on them, what's the purpose? Yeah. It becomes a bit of a challenge.
Exactly. I'm curious, Nathen, you probably have the opportunity to speak with many kind of leaders in all kinds of engineering organizations. And I'm curious if you kind of see a common thread between, or maybe a kind of consistent constellation of like goals and objectives. Like I imagine when people are talking to you, perhaps they have some idea like we're not deploying quickly enough, or our code quality isn't where we want it to be, or our culture sucks, or name your list, right? But I'm curious kind of what you tend to see being out there. Like what are the kind of goals and objectives people have?
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely see all different things, but I think that it kind of boils down to a couple of things. First, the teams that I'm working with recognize maybe one of two things. Technology is that enabler. So we need to get better at delivering technology. We need to be better at shipping faster. It takes too long. But the other side of it is cost also, right? There are certainly organizations who aren't yet viewing technology as an enabler so much as continuing to view technology as a cost center. And so really in those conversations, we really need to help demonstrate sometimes to leadership how technology can be a benefit and how technology can enable the business. So we start having questions or conversations around, well, and even like imaginary conversations. What would it feel like if your team was deploying twice as frequently, if they were able to ship changes to your customers twice as frequently? You're accelerating how quickly you respond to your users. You're accelerating how quickly you can adapt to forces in the market, right? But then I also get questions that say, whoa, but security. We need to be safe. Like we can't just willy-nilly start shipping more and more frequently. What about safety and security? And Maxim, the truth is that when we have a vulnerability, a security vulnerability in production, we need to be able to remediate that quickly. And it turns out, interestingly, that the muscles that we build to remediate security vulnerabilities are the same muscles that we need to ship features faster. If you think about it at the end of the day, and maybe if you step back and squint a little bit, a change is a change is a change is a change. Like they're all changes that were flowing through the system. So even thinking about these different capabilities, you can apply them in a security context. You can apply them in a how do we ship better features. In fact, you can apply them basically across almost any type of technology that you're trying to deliver, including things like how do we know that our AI system is working well? Well, we can measure it using these 4 key metrics, and we can use the insights from those capabilities to help drive that. And then I guess the final thing I'll say on this is that oftentimes as we dig in with teams, the answer, the capability where they need to focus is surprising. It's not the thing that was blatantly obvious at the beginning, but as we dig through some of the capabilities and some of the outcomes that we're driving towards, they become a little bit more clear. This is where we need to go and invest.
I love that. I hadn't really thought about it that way. This idea that if you're going after some of these goals, that you're kind of unavoidably developing the skills and the culture that's going to have all of these positive side effects, right? Where it's like you maybe are training your leg strength because you want to become a good skier, and it's like, oh, magically moving furniture is also easier all of a sudden.
Right. Absolutely. And you said that culture word again. So I would feel remiss if I didn't share this couple of slides here. So as we talk about culture within our research, we actually lean on other researchers' methods. We're kind of like, open source software engineers. We're going to borrow great ideas from other places as well. So there's a sociologist named Ron Westrom who's done a lot of investigation into the culture of organizations and the culture of teams. And he spends a lot of time in safety critical places, things like emergency rooms, nuclear power plants, and so forth. But what he's done through his research is help identify this topology of organizational cultures, where you have that pathological or power-oriented team or organization on the left-hand side, and then the generative or performance-oriented team on the right-hand side. And I find that almost without fail, if I put this table in front of a team, maybe silently, they start to identify exactly where their team and where their organization fits in this topology. Of course, we'd like everyone as a team, and certainly the place I want to work, is leaning more towards that generative side, where we are taking, failure as an opportunity to learn. We're taking well-informed risks, and that's encouraged with our team. These are some great ways that we can improve. But when we talk about culture, we're not talking about, foosball tables and free lunch. We're really talking about how information flows within the organization. How do your people feel? What's burnout like, and so forth.
I really like this, and I think it's so important, and it's something we talk about all the time with DevLake, especially with some of our larger users, where it's so critical to be able to articulate, like, what's the value of this new magic metrics machine, right? What's the goal of these kind of new DORA dashboards? And hey, it's not for scapegoating. It's not for figuring out who to punish or yell at, right? It's very much focused on, like, how do you celebrate success, and how do you drive a culture of improvement, and how do you find those opportunities to really unleash the capability of your people in a way that's more systematic and targeted. So I really think this is so important.
Awesome.
So I'm curious, Nathen, we see a lot of success with DORA at what I would call like scale, right? Naturally, larger organizations, they've got more data, more people, they've got more history, they've probably got more visibility challenges, of course. But I'd like to kind of go down to like the smaller guys. We see so many startups that have aspirations to dive into something like DORA and turn it to action. And I'm curious from your perspective, really kind of two questions. Like, is there such a thing as kind of too small of a team to really make sense of this stuff? And beyond that point of too small, like, what do those kind of smaller teams, how can they maybe think about this, and what recommendations would you have for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for those smaller teams, it's really important. I guess the first thing I'll say is that it doesn't matter how small your team is. Things that matter to you are getting feedback on the systems that you're building and the way that you're delivering to your customers, whoever those customers might be. And in the earliest of teams, like, you're just trying to figure out, is there actually a product market fit for what I'm building? Well, the best way to find that out is to get feedback from real customers. And when you get that feedback, to be able to respond to that feedback. So I think that even as a team of one, you probably don't need a dashboard, but you should be asking yourself questions like, how frequently am I able to deploy? How quickly can I change what I've put into production? Am I able to quickly recover from a failure? So these 4 key metrics at the top level matter. And then even as an individual, well, if I'm not answering it in the way that I want, how do I get better? Let's look at some of these capabilities. So I would say that as a smaller team, it can actually almost be easier, because in a smaller team, there's probably much more open conversation. You're probably co-located, or at least hanging out all the time in Zoom or in a Google Meet. So there's a lot of context that's shared. As the teams grow and we start to specialize, that's where that context kind of starts to fall apart. And we have to have that shared context so that we can all drive towards those same goals. So if you're a team that's just getting started, the first thing I would do is say, the dashboards probably don't matter. What matters is serving your users. At some point, you will want those dashboards, and then you're going to want something that's easy to get implemented and can pull all the data that you need. Something like DevLake maybe is a good place for that. But before that, I would start just with conversations amongst your team, or maybe, like I said, the trusty old Post-it, in your retros, in your planning meetings, ask those hard questions. How frequently did we deploy since the last time? Let's just ask that question and see what that leads us to.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it's something you've touched upon, which I also think is perhaps an underappreciated part of certainly DORA, but more broadly, I think many of the dashboards that we have in DevLake too is I think it helps teams really kind of communicate with other teams, right? Especially other non-technical teams that they're coordinating with. And I'm curious kind of how what you've seen out there and what your experience has been with kind of bridging those gaps where you've got the engineering organization, they know themselves, they've got the metrics, they understand what they're doing. Do you have any recommendations for kind of turning that into shared conversations with other teams and kind of busting down those silos?
Yeah, I think that the important thing there is that when we're going to other groups, when we're talking with other teams, it's important to have an understanding of the language and the concerns of those other teams. I think about my own history as, someone who was responsible for the running systems, in a smaller startup. And one day, the CEO called me up. It was a Saturday and said, "Nathen, there's something wrong with the site. Like, we aren't processing as many orders as we should." And so as the, good web operations person, the first thing I did was pull up my dashboards. And I said, "No, boss, everything's green. We're good to go." Turns out our monitors were all green, but there was actually a problem with the site, right? And me telling him that our monitors are all green, like, that didn't solve the problem. It didn't help us reach a better understanding. I didn't understand his intuition about what was wrong with the business on that day and the way that transactions were flowing, and I couldn't see it. So he had an intuition and a feeling and some insights that were telling him something was wrong. I looked at the data that I had and said everything is good. So it really is about having a better understanding of what are the goals and how do we communicate that with one another. I can't go to a CEO and say, "Hey, you know what I did this year? I wrote 200% more lines of code this year, so I think I deserve a bonus or a raise." Like, it's meaningless. It's a meaningless thing, right? And so it really does come down to understanding whether we're talking to finance, we're talking to lawyers, we're talking to chief executives. What's the business of their business? How are they communicating about that? And then I think the tip for how to get better on that is to have those conversations before you need those conversations, right? So, DevOps is this thing where it started with developers and operators collaborating more together. The best way to collaborate, go to lunch together. Start seeing each other as people, and stop othering each other. And when we do that, when we have those conversations in advance, we can start to build better empathy and understanding for who that other team is. And then we can start communicating much more clearly with them.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I know we're coming up on time here, so I'll ask one more question in a second. For those still here, thanks for sticking around, and we'll wrap up in just a few minutes. Quick note, dropped in the chat here, you'll see a Slack invite for those of you who aren't in there. Nathan's in there. We're so thankful to have him engaging with folks in there. And then you can come join the community if you're looking to implement DORA, or you're getting stuck with something or you have questions. We'll be starting up a channel in there that's dedicated to DORA. So you'll be able to get support from me, from everyone on the team, and from the community. So make sure to jump in. To wrap things up, Nathen, I'm curious, maybe kind of a forward-thinking, open-ended question. Where do you see kind of the state of DORA evolving, changing, and perhaps more broadly, like the state of what we always like to refer to as data-driven engineering?
I had some alarm going off. Sorry. Okay, so to answer your question, I think the future of DORA is pretty bright, but it requires us as a community to continue to participate in it. I think that one of the most valuable things of the research itself is that we do receive input from organizations of every shape and size across every industry. And so it is this deeper understanding of how teams are actually working today that provides us all these great insights for how do we move forward. And I think that the future of all of this, look, there's artificial intelligence that's coming on. There's just better developer tooling that is introduced across every aspect of software development. Some of these new tools are going to take practice to get used to. Some of them are going to work really well for us, and some of them maybe we're going to find out we're not the best choice. I think the future really is, as humans, as engineers, we need to really prioritize and understand that we have to have this resiliency, and we have to take on this mindset of continuous learning. We're always going to be trying and learning new things. I think that is so important. And I also think that we need to move beyond just what are the custom applications that I'm building, because as more and more services become available to us, maybe it's not an application that I'm building, but more an application that I'm composing, where I'm pulling together this API over here, this software as a service over there, running on this platform that I don't control anymore. But at the end of the day, bringing all of those things together really is about creating that experience for our customers, and doing so in a way that allows us to change the system and respond to new ideas, new demands from the customers.
I think that's really well said. And I think it, kind of ties our conversation up with a nice, neat bow, is like touching upon a few things, right? Which is ultimately this stuff is about continuous improvement. It's about driving a culture that serves that. It's about driving a culture that serves flow and communication and shared responsibility and a shared perspective on supporting a great experience for customers. And we always like to talk about that also, that DORA, maybe in and of itself, right, is not super exciting. And you always hear about, some stubborn CTO or CEO who's like, I don't care about code, I don't care about, velocity, I just want my customers to be happy. Where it's like, well, guess what? Happy customers have products that are being well maintained, consistently updated, don't experience outages or downtime frequently, are reliable. Like all of these things, you focus on them, guess what? You'll get to happy customers. So I love that you said it that way.
Absolutely. And it's not just happy customers, to be quite fair. When you have a system that allows for frequent code updates, low outages, high reliability, typically the engineers working in that system are happier as well. And so happier engineers make for more productive engineers, make for happier customers and more productive businesses. So I think that there's just a lot of good in all of this.
I totally agree. DORA equips you to take care of the people that take care of you.
Absolutely. And Maxim, just before we wrap, I want to share two quick resources here as well. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, I highly recommend going and grabbing the 2022 Accelerate State of DevOps report. This is the annual summary of the latest and greatest from our research findings. So take a look at that. And then I hope to see you all in the DevLake Slack channel. I'm there every day, and I'd love to interact with you there. And we also have a separate community that I'd invite you to join, DORA.community. At DORA.community, we have a mailing list. Maybe someday we'll have a Slack channel. We don't have one yet, but we do have a very active mailing list, and we hold regular virtual meetings. In fact, right before this meeting, I was with some DevLakers over in a DORA community discussion about the ROI and how do we measure from a financial perspective the improvements that we're making. So I would encourage everyone to please join us at DORA.community as well, and make sure that you've downloaded the State of DevOps report.
Absolutely. No, and a big +1 to Dora.community. It's great discussions in there, some really friendly people. Like I've made some new virtual friends that way, and we've already chatted. So it's such a great place.
Excellent.
Nathen, I can't thank you enough for your time today, for being part of our community, for making yourself available. Such an honor to have you on today. Thank you for tuning in. Everyone for joining us today. Thank you for taking the time out of your mornings, evenings, wherever you are, to join us and really kind of dive into this framework, dive into the lake. I never tire of saying that. As a reminder, we'll be sharing this recording out, and we hope you'll share it with others. It'll be shared first in the Slack, and then it will, of course, be broadly available on the DevLake YouTube. The Slack invite is in the chat. If you haven't clicked it already or aren't already a part of it, do dive in. As I mentioned, we're all there answering questions, sharing our insights. Nathan's there, and many other fantastic citizens of the DORA universe. So Nathen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Maxim. It's really been my pleasure. And I would just say as a closing thought, if you take away one thing, let it be this. use DORA and the community around it to help your team get better at getting better. If we can all just get better at getting better, we'll all be in a much better place.
I love that. So well said. Well, with that, we will close it out. I can't possibly say it better than that. So we'll see you on Slack, guys. Nathen, always a pleasure. And
Thank you all. Thanks, Maxim, for having me. It was really a privilege.
All right, guys. We'll see you on the Slack. Bye for now.